Hello and welcome to this presentation on cross-border enrollment. My name's Nathan Chadwick. I'm a senior director here and a therapeutic strategy lead of rare disease at Worldwide Clinical Trials. I've been working in the CRO and the clinical trial industry for around about 15 years. Have spent most of my career working in project management and clinical operations, predominantly with biotech companies and almost always in trials in rare disease. So between my own experience and the experience of us as a company, we've developed some really interesting insights, top tips, guidance, and best practices when it comes to cross-border enrollment. Cross-border enrollment is something that most people have heard of, but actually very few have implemented on a trial. Even now that we're in 2025, post-COVID, with all of the decentralized tactics, it's still not something that is commonly used. And so throughout today's presentation, I'm hoping that I can provide a background on cross-border enrollment, how and when it can be used, talk about some of the challenges, both regulatory, operational, and logistical, when implementing a cross-border enrollment strategy, and then provide a case study of when Worldwide has successfully implemented this strategy and also some of our top tips and best practices. Now, before I start, as I work in the rare disease space, and rare disease is commonly where we see cross-border enrollment being utilized, I want to give a brief introduction into rare diseases. There are now over 10,000 rare diseases documented in the literature. About 80% of them have a genetic origin, and that's going to become really important in a couple of slides' time, because what we see in these rare diseases with the genetic origin are use of genetic medicines, such as gene therapies or antisense oligonucleotides or ASOs. And those trials lend themselves really well to a cross-border enrollment strategy. Now, there are over 36 million Europeans who actually live with a rare disease. And just to put that into context, that's more people than live in Ukraine, more people than live in Australia, and it's about the same amount of people that live in Poland. So you can see that although the classification of a rare disease means that in the US, it has to affect less than 200,000 Americans, or over here in Europe means that it has to have a prevalence of 1 in 50,000, we still see a large number of people who are affected by these 10,000 rare diseases. 70% of these start in childhood, and 95% of rare diseases still lack any approved efficacious therapeutic. And again, this is going to become a really important statistic that I'll refer back to later on in the presentation. Unfortunately, around about 30% of children diagnosed with a rare disease won't see their 5th birthday. And a lot of patients that have a rare disease go through what we like to call a diagnostic odyssey. And it actually takes around about 5 years for them to get that correct diagnosis. Rare diseases globally affect more people than cancer and AIDS combined. Briefly now talking about what is cross-border enrollment. As the name would suggest, and as the graphic on the right here highlight, it is the process of enabling patients in one country to participate in a clinical trial conducted in another country. Now, we see this very often in rare diseases or in precision medicine trials where patient pools are really limited. Now, some of the big motivations for why we use this is it can address those unmet medical needs. As I just mentioned, 95% of rare diseases do not have an approved treatment. And so being able to move a patient from a country where we know there will be no treatment to a country where there is a clinical trial is not only the right thing to do ethically, but it can also support clinical drug development. Three main types of cross-border enrollment that we see. The first, an in-country stay. So what you'll see here is the patient starts off at home, then they'll fly from their home to a research center in another country, and they'll stay there throughout the duration of the clinical trial and then fly back home at the end. This is really useful in earlier phase trials that are shorter in duration, or in trials with high disease burden where access to specialists, potentially pediatric trials where you're going to need intensive care, this is probably the solution that you would want to look at. The second type is traveling to and from a country. So as you'll see here, the little home icon, then the plane icon, then the hospital icon, then the plane, then the home, and so on and so forth. So this is whereby the patient, instead of getting in their car or taking a train or bus or walking to their hospital in their country, they will simply take an airplane or another method of transport and travel across a border to travel to their trial site. And they'll continue doing that for every single visit back and forth until the trial is completed. Now, I mentioned ASOs as a therapeutic that we see quite often in rare diseases, especially neurological diseases with a genetic origin. ASOs usually have a lifespan of around about 3 to 4 months, and therefore every 3 to 4 months you would need to come back for another dose and for another dose. And so with that break of 3 to 4 months, this type of cross-border enrollment is really well suited to that type of trial where the patient can travel for 5, 6, 7 hours on a plane once every 3 months, once every 4 months. And then the final type is ultimately just a single visit. This is whereby the patient would fly to the specialist center for one visit, they would fly home, and they would continue to see their regular doctor in their country for the duration of the clinical trial. We've seen this a number of times on gene therapy studies where the dosing happens just once, particularly in gene therapies which are using very invasive or very novel administration methodologies. And so we had an ophthalmology study just recently where we proposed using this strategy to fly patients from their home countries to specific surgical centers to have the gene therapy delivered, and then they go back to their home country and their treating ophthalmologist in their home country would continue on the rest of the trial. Now I'm going to talk about how and when can you think about using cross-border enrollment. First time that I think you can start to think about this is expanding the patient access. If we know that there are patients in countries, however, those countries are difficult to access or they haven't got a lot of trial experience, then cross-border enrollment could be the solution. We know that trial diversity is a big topic, and making sure that you have a representative population is becoming one of the decision-making factors for regulatory approval, and you believe that you don't have enough diversity, again, expanding the breadth of your study by using cross-border enrollment is a further solution. Most clinical trials, and I think every clinical trial I've ever worked on since I started in industry over 15 years ago, would have loved and would still love to come in quicker, faster, a month, 2 months, 3 months. And so accelerating recruitment by opening the doors up to more patients in more countries, you do potentially have the option of speeding up your clinical trial recruitment process. And then finally, there are a number of regulatory harmonization initiatives, not just EU CTR, but there's more that I'll dive into as we go through. What I'm going to show now is a study that was done back in 2020 out of Leuven University, and it was supported by the European Forum for Good Clinical Practice. So they performed online surveys and semi-structured interviews of around about 400 people from varying different stakeholders. And what we see on the left-hand side here is overwhelmingly 92% of those 400 people said that we do need cross-border access to clinical trials. On the right-hand side, what you'll see that these stakeholders were relatively well represented across the stakeholders we see in research. So we had nearly 50% of investigators, combined with organizations and individual patients, they represented nearly 30%. The sponsors who create these medicines and ultimately pay for the investigation into their development made up around 10%, and the remaining 12% was made up of other stakeholders as well as ethics groups and regulators. Now, they went into this a little bit deeper, and they wanted to understand if there was any differences between what patients feel and what doctors feel, and why they would be motivated to suggest or to ask to be part of a cross-border enrollment trial. And overwhelmingly, what we saw out of that is that access to medication or treatment is the biggest motivator. So on the left-hand side, you can see that 82% of patients were motivated by the fact that the medication isn't marketed. If it's not marketed in their country, it means that they cannot access that treatment. That was followed by 80% of those patients being motivated because there was not a trial site near them. And if we look on the physician side, overwhelmingly, nearly 90% of physicians would recommend one of their patients to join a trial in another country because it means that they would get access to a treatment which they do not currently have available to them. So similar sentiment shared by both the physicians and the patients. But now, what about the barriers? It's great that people are motivated. As we've seen previously, 92% of stakeholders interviewed feel like we should have access to cross-border enrollment. And as we've just seen from the previous slide, both physicians and patients are highly motivated because 95% of rare diseases still don't have an approved treatment. However, cross-border enrollment is not something which is simple. It requires a dedicated multi-stakeholder team from the sponsor, from the CRO, and from vendors. Now, this study further looked into some of the barriers, and they broke this down into those who have no experience with cross-border enrollment, so the cross-border enrollment naive group, and those who did have cross-border enrollment experience. And really, if we look across the two groups, the main four themes are consistent across the two. They are logistics, distance, and cost. So first of all, the logistical and financial burden to the patient. Second of all would be the distance between the patient's home and the trial site. Third, the timing and the frequency. So as I mentioned earlier on, when we were talking about that second strategy where the patient had to travel back and forward every single time, if that study has visits every 3 months, every 4 months, that's doable. That seems like something that patients would be willing to do. However, if that was once a month or every 2 weeks, that's where you're going to see that become a larger barrier. And then lastly is the financial coverage of costs. Now, one of the interesting pieces here, which came up during the interview section rather than in the surveys, is that patients actually divulged that they would be willing to look for a research site in another country, even if their country had open and active research sites. And one of the reasons that was for, when the team at Leuven dug a little bit deeper, was actually they may live closer to that site, which can be quite common out over here in Europe, or they had more trust in that other country's healthcare system. I just want to take the first point because that was a really, really interesting point. As we know, in Europe, we have a lot of countries that are very densely geographically packed in. And because of the EU, there is freedom of movement allowed between those countries. So let's say we had a clinical trial up and running in Spain. Spain is part of what we call the Big Five in research and is commonly used in most large phase 2, phase 3 studies. We have a patient who's up in Barcelona, up in the northeast of the country. However, the only Spanish sites are down in the south, in Seville. Now, on a traditional trial, we would identify this patient in Barcelona, and our first thought would be, how can we get them down to Seville? We'll pay for a train, we'll pay for airfare, we will pay overnight hotel stays. I don't think we would ever think as researchers, we have France open and we have a site in Toulouse or Marseille, and it's actually going to be a lot cheaper. It's going to be easier for the patient, which is one of the most important drivers here, for them to travel to Marseille or Toulouse for care. And I think that's what I would really like people to take home from this. Cross-border enrollment, yes, it is something new. Yes, it is something that we can start to implement. And I do think we should start to challenge the status quo of how we usually do things on trials, especially in rare diseases where we have this huge unmet need and a real need to service these patients and the community. I mentioned at the start, there are a number of different challenges when running and implementing a cross-border enrollment strategy. These can be regulatory. Unfortunately, there is no one harmonized law globally which governs cross-border enrollment for clinical trials. And so for each trial, we need to make sure that we satisfy both regulatory and ethical guidance for the country that the patient is currently in, their home country, and the country that they are going to be treated in. In 2016, we had the emergence of GDPR. This adds an extra layer of complexity. Logistical hurdles. How do you get that patient from A to B? This needs to be something which is 365 days a year, 24/7. It's not as simple as taking a patient from their home country and sending them to another. How are they going to get from their home to the airport? Is there going to be wheelchair assistance if they need it? How many family members are they going to be allowed to bring with them, especially if this is going to be a cross-border enrollment strategy which has the patient staying in the treating country for a number of weeks or potentially months? Who's going to cover the costs? So this may seem simple on the surface. As we know, when we ask patients to join clinical trials, we make sure that they are not out of pocket. So any of their travel is covered, and where possible, we like to try and pay them for appreciating their time and efforts as a stipend. However, the financial cost here goes deeper. What happens if the patient has an AE or an accident when they're in the treating country? Who's liable for that cost? Is it the treating country? Is it the home country? Is it the sponsor? Now, this isn't a huge issue in Europe, where again, we have free and equitable access to healthcare. But let's imagine you have a patient from a country that is outside of the EU traveling into the EU. And then also, who's responsible for care after the trial is finished? If they've been treated in one country with a gene therapy, let's say, or a CAR T therapy, these therapies have a regulatory follow-up of around about 5 years for gene therapies that are viral vectored, or up to 15 years for CAR T therapies. Who's responsible for post-trial follow-up? Again, is it the treating country or is it the home country? These are things that as researchers, we will need to think about before we implement strategies. And lastly is awareness. Patients are often unaware of clinical trials that are running in their own country, let alone trials that are running in different countries. And so how can we support the awareness of trials in these different countries? Now, I'm glad to say that there is work that is being done. So the European Forum for Good Clinical Practice and the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations joined together back in 2020, actually off the back of that study, which I'd previously mentioned out of Leuven, to come up with the EUXCT task force. This is a multi-stakeholder group which comprises of regulators, ethical groups, patient advocacy groups, sponsors, CROs, and academics who are trying to get together to understand the challenges around cross-border enrollment and to support the implementation of a framework which will support researchers who want to implement this. So the task forces are broken down into 3 main groups. Those are legal, regulatory, and ethics, financial, and operational, which if we look back to the previous slide, you'll see that those are the major barriers that we have seen in the past when implementing this type of strategy. So the first final set of recommendations was made public in June. There will be a link at the end of this presentation that people can follow to get to the EU XCT website. And as well as those recommendations, there is specific country level guidance that already exists for the Czech Republic, for Denmark, for Finland, for France, for Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. And Worldwide is a proud supporter of this initiative. Now, I'd like to move on as we start the wrap up to a case study. This is a study that Worldwide is currently running. This is a very rare pediatric condition, which, since it was reported in the medical literature in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there have only been around about 200 cases documented globally. So it falls under the bracket of an ultra rare disease. And what you'll see at the bottom is you'll see that we identified a number of patients in a wide array of home countries, and we moved those patients to the most logical country that made sense for that patient that we had currently up and active on the trial. The reason that we were able to do this and the real success factors were, first of all, the patient navigation. There was a very well coordinated relationship between the sponsor, between Worldwide, and also between the advocacy organization that enabled us to have access to each one of these potentially eligible patients and their families and understand, would they be willing to try and join a trial in another country, and then start to triage them and put an action plan in place. Now, one of the biggest challenges of this is we never knew where these potential patients were going to be. And like many clinical trials, we had a rolling timeline of new sites and new countries coming onto the trial. So also that meant we never knew where the patient could be enrolled and could be treated. And so having regulatory intelligence in both the home country and then in the open trial site country was another key success factor. Finally, it was the logistics. So this was making sure we always had someone on hand. We always had someone available. As I mentioned before, this has to be 365, 247. What happens is this is out of hours. What happens if it's on a weekend? We had to make sure that we planned out of offices to make sure that somebody was always available in that country to be available for these patients should anything arise or occur. And as you can see, what this meant was patients with an ultra-rare disease got a potentially life-saving treatment, and we managed to do that from 11 home countries to one of our 5 enrolling trial countries. So as we wrap up, I just want to talk about some top tips. So the first one is plan, plan, plan. If you haven't managed to glean this from today's presentation, cross-border enrollment is a very impactful, however, it is a very difficult strategy to implement. And so you need to make sure that you leave no stone unturned. The planning needs to include cross-functional representation from all the stakeholders, including the sponsor, the CRO, any vendors, but also within the divisions of each of those groups as well. So project management, clinical operations, ethics, regulatory, legal, finance, supply. The next is define. Define what your strategy looks like. Review your protocol and work out which one of the 3 main types, or potentially even more types, of cross-border enrollment strategies you want to implement. The third is, let's talk about the wants and needs. This arguably should be the first top tip because it takes all this planning, it takes all this definition. Do the patients want this? And will your treating physicians accept this? So one of the first things that you need to do is go out, ask the patient community, would they be willing to travel to a different country for the purpose of this trial? And then ask some of your key opinion leaders, ask some of your potential clinical sites that you're thinking about, would you be willing to accept a patient from another country? And if you were, what steps would we need to take to make sure they were happy to receive that patient? I just mentioned before, using those local specialists, using the people within those countries who understand the regulatory and ethical impacts, because there is no one governing guidance like there is ICH-ECP, which we can follow through. We need to make sure that every single country has somebody in it, because each time we move a patient for each study, it will be unique. It will be a bespoke case of cross-border enrollment. Next is using liaisons, expert patient liaisons who can support with the patient's travel from one country to another, or potentially something like a clinical trial liaison. This is a role that we have here at Worldwide. These are people who are PhD or MD level that can support the hospital with some of the logistical complexities that it takes to organize cross-border enrollment and to facilitate the moving from a patient from one country to another. The next is pre-screening consent. So there will be nothing more frustrating from the patient perspective to get on a plane for a number of hours and have to give up a weekend or give up a whole week to go and screen for a study that they were never going to be eligible for. And so when thinking about cross-border enrollment, it's really important to ensure the access to information for the treating country from the home country. And a pre-screening consent facilitates that. So the home country can provide all the documentation to the treating country, as well as even potentially running some preliminary tests to make sure that we reduce the risk of screen fails. I've already mentioned about what happens after. So after the trial, who is responsible for the care of this patient? Is it the home country? Is it the treating country? As I've mentioned, this is a very, very difficult thing to do, and it's even more difficult to get right. Potentially, you're never going to know where the patients are coming from, and you're never going to know where you're going to need to send them to. And so having a trusted vendor partner who has implemented cross-border enrollment before, who has a near global coverage and can act quickly and almost immediately is going to be key. And then finally, advertise. If you are going to do this, do not leave this blind to the community. The community wants this, they want to know about it. And so work with advocacy groups, both globally, within the specific countries, and then also think about working within the physician network. Over here in Europe, we have a lot of the European Centers of Excellence and the European reference networks. Make sure they're all aware that this is happening to try and improve the chance of success. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the future. First of all, I think the future is bright. As you can see, there is a large spotlight that's being shone on cross-border enrollment. There is a lot of investment, both from academia, from sponsors, from the CRO side, and ultimately from the patient community to make this successful. And that investment and that passion, I think, is only going to be beneficial. And if I look into my crystal ball at what the future holds, my hope is that the future for cross-border enrollment is very similar to what we saw with things like e-consent or with e-diaries. When they first came out, they felt like this far-fetched idea that we could never hit, we could never strive. And now we talk about them as commonplace in clinical trials. My hope is in 5-10 years, once the initial pathfinders work out the lessons learned, as we create better regulatory framework, as we create better global understanding of how we can implement these strategies, that in those 5 to 10 years, we're talking about cross-border enrollment the same way we talk about things like e-consent, e-pro, and e-diaries in today. And so with that, I will thank everybody for listening. I hope you found this helpful. And if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.